Too Scared to Tell is the last of Kathy Glass's memoirs that I have to reread and review, and I'm slightly devastated because I have spent the last month and a half, I think, going back to the beginning, rereading them all for the purpose of reviewing them and sharing my thoughts, and this is the last one that I need to review. And I have to say, it's pretty great and ending on a high, and her next book is only a couple of weeks away, so not too long to wait. But Too Scared to Tell is the story of a 6-year-old boy called Oscar, and apparently his teachers had raised concerns with social services prior to this, but one morning when he comes to school with a red mark on his face, it was the straw that broke the camel's back, and finally he was taken into care. And it transpires that his mother Roxana is actually abroad in their home country visiting Oscar's sick brother Luca. And because she had to leave quickly, she had to leave Oscar behind with friends, and I'm putting that in air quotes because these people are all living in shared accommodation. There are a lot of adults there, and they kind of share responsibility for all of the children there. And while that's not uncommon, it's not exactly acceptable to social services. But that's not all. There are things that Oscar begins to speak about that show that there's something much darker going on here. What I will say is that this is, I won't say it sugarcoats anything, but compared to some abuse that some children have suffered, it talks about it quite lightly. If I had to compare it to, say, Jodie's story, which is just horrendous in its disclosure after disclosure, this is kind of like Oscar spends half the book being too reserved and too scared to say anything, and then he gives a bit of information, it's dealt with, and then they move on. And actually, looking back, not a lot happens. Not much happens in this book at all. But because Oscar's a really likable character, and because a lot of it is uncertain, certainly with his future and where he's going to end up living, it is still quite interesting, and there's enough there to sustain interest. It also drops a nugget at one point about Lucy, and I won't say any more than that. Having, of course, read the books that come after this, I'm well aware of what happens with that, but that's a fantastic bit of writing. That hook to make the reader want to know what's happening, and then make you wait 6 months or so until the next book comes out, absolutely fantastically done. So it's very well written from an entertainment perspective, but also from an educational perspective about the workings of social services and various issues that are faced with this case. I think is very well done as well. It's not my personal favourite, it's not the most gripping, it's not the most action-packed, but Oscar is very likeable. He's a very sweet little boy. And even though not much happens, it actually is a really enjoyable read that, like all of the rest of Kathy Glass's books, is pretty impossible to put down. If you haven't read any of her books, I'd say this is a good entry-level book because it's not quite as harrowing as, for example, Jodie's story. It's a good way to see if you can read about child abuse, which may sound like a weird thing to say, but people have different levels of tolerance. Certainly if you've had past experiences, maybe some things are just too triggering. This is a pretty good entry level. It's got enough shocking detail that it's gripping, but it's not so severe that it will make you cry. Well, maybe it will, but certainly compared to a lot of others, it's a good entry level book. But I also, having now done it, thoroughly recommend reading them chronologically because it's just, I feel fully immersed in the world that these books have created. The world, of course, based on truth, but with a lot of differences. It wouldn't surprise me if Kathy's children are actually an older girl, a younger boy, and then an adopted son. It definitely wouldn't surprise me if things had just been completely flipped on its head. But the world that we are presented with, fully immersed in it over the last few months, really have thoroughly enjoyed rereading all of these books. Cannot wait for the next one, and definitely thoroughly recommend Too Scared to Tell.